All right, guys. So this is the second part, which is actually the last part of the human demography activity. So in here, I'm going to talk about based on the result analysis that we just discussed. Um, how to interpret those results. We'll go in detail into that. How to write the report the results section, and how to write the discussion part, and how to wrap this up activity. That's what we are going to cover in the next in this particular section. So I'm going to quickly reflect back on the fact that the hypothesis is something really important. Whenever you write these sections, do not forget that, right? So as you continue this section, you do not have to revise your intro or methods, right? Even if you received a relatively poor grade, and most of you did not receive a bad grade, even if you did, you do not you are not required to resubmit, because there's no, if you look at the grading rubric at the end of this towards the end of the assignment guidelines, there is no resubmission required, right? So I'm only going to grade your results and discussion section and literature cited. Now that said, I do not want you to forget the fact that everything you write should be connected back to your original hypotheses, the two hypotheses. Now, I just finished grading your labs, so I do from what I recall, most of you picked the same second hypothesis, males versus females. And I do also recall that most of you argued that males actually have, most of you, interestingly, few of you argued otherwise. Most of you argued males having a greater mortality than females, and also the first cemetery versus the historic versus modern populations. And also there were different predictions amongst you, but basically almost all of you picked the same two hypotheses. The first same hypothesis essentially will be the same because because I asked you to pick the same one. The second one, um, I provided the example for males and females, and you did pick that particular example I mentioned, which is completely fine, which is a great hypothesis, has a lot of biological relevance and importance. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is I said that few of you did not get this right. So if you are one of them, you need to, although you are not writing your hypothesis, think about it, because you need to revisit the hypothesis when you report your results. Okay, always in your head, keep this as the center, right? Your discussion and the results pivot around your hypothesis, right? Now, you will read chapter 3 and chapter 4 of this writing guide, right, which you are required to have. I'm going to bring this up close to the camera. Right, so do read this before you start writing, and you're going to have plenty of time to write it, because the biggest importance of reading that is actually learning this scientific style of writing, right? That's quite important. Again, most of you did pick that, but few of you did not. So it's hard to teach how to scientifically write. Particularly, there's no need to do that when the book explains it pretty well. If I were to explain it, it would be exactly the same way as this book does. Some of the feedback I provided to you, a first half of the assignment, will also help you to determine what went wrong. So no, that's the first things first, right? How to prepare for it, and how to write, and to keep the hypothesis in your mind, and also the outlining activity you did with respect to the primate demography paper, right? So that book style, that paper follows the scientific style. So I want you to follow the same style. And again, most of you did, but again, always few of you kind of strayed away from the scientific style of writing. Okay, I do not want to see popular science writing, which I mentioned in the very beginning, right? And write the way, I mean, you have to write this intro and methods. You already read some scientific articles, adopt that particular style, right? And this is not the first time I'm mentioning this. And I also reflect back on this image, right? I mentioned that in the intro, from intro, as you get into the methods, it's like an inverted triangle, right? You start very broadly and then very specifically tailor towards objectives, and methods that are developed towards specifically to test your hypothesis. Results and discussion also follows a regular triangle, right? Because results are very specifically related to the hypothesis and objectives that you developed, right? And discussion gradually gets broader. First, of course, the discussion is related to strictly interpreting and explaining your results. Next, it gets a little broader as you connect your findings to similar other research, right? And then you try to place your results, your findings at a greater context of human demography, right? Human health and human survival. And so keep that also in your mind as you elaborate on this particular section, right? And then of course you end with literature cited. Now do not forget literature cited. A couple of you did forget to mention your literature cited, right? And also in lab manual, chapter 6 tells you what format to use to cite and format literature. Now abstract. So for this activity, once you finish everything up, right, I want you to actually produce an abstract, and towards the end of this presentation I will go into detail of what I expect in the abstract. But as you know, because you have already read papers, abstract is a summary of the entire paper. It should highlight the most basic parts from your intro, right? The most important part of your methods, results, and discussion, right? And abstracts does not contain literature cited. I will cover that part towards the end of this presentation, right? And I will actually assign a particular grade in the rubric for your abstract, a very smaller component. What do you find in your results? So basically you state what you found from your graphs, right? From your results, right? Any and your statistical inferences, right? So remember, like I did interpret the graph in the previous lecture, and I mentioned how to interpret this statistically and to use the word significant, right? If you have your graphs overlapping, it's or if your line graphs are overlapping, non-significant. If they are not overlapping, that is not significant, right? And you might actually have your graphs either completely overlapping or completely not overlapping, or partially overlapping. So either way, interpret it as it is. If it is partially overlapping, does it overlap the most of the way? Does it overlap only for a small fraction of the way? My fake graph, actually I intentionally made it so it overlapped about a quarter of the way, right? So I actually considered, because most of the way it does not, the two graphs do not overlap, so I interpreted my graphs as statistically significant, right? Significantly different in terms of mortality. You have to mention that as well, right? Like it's different in terms of what? Mortality, right? It kind of infers survival, but I prefer to use the word mortality because that's exactly what's visible. But yes, of course, inverse of mortality is the survival. So there's nothing wrong by interpreting the graphs with respect to survival either. So state whether your original biological hypothesis was supported. There are two hypotheses, right? And you have to separately relate your findings to each of your hypotheses, right? And state the inference, right? Either way, but if like in my fake data, if my original hypothesis, biological hypothesis was supported, great, that's terrific. If it is not, doesn't mean you did anything wrong. Keep that in your mind first. So do not try to hide it if your biological hypothesis was not supported, right? Just state that, there's no significant differences between the two graphs. As such, my biological hypothesis was not supported. That's completely fine. And state what hypothesis it is, right? There are two of them. So I want you to be very clear. And what kind of patterns do you see in each survivorship curve? Like in my case, if I were to describe my graph, I could say my historical population consistently remained relatively at a greater survival or lower mortality, my historical population consistently remained at a greater mortality rate than the modern population, and after a certain point, the mortality did not differ significantly between the two populations, right? So like that, you separately interpret each curve with respect to the other curve, right? And explain the pattern, right? And also you can mention, is the mortality increasing gradually, or is it dramatically changing, right? In my case, in my fake data, actually there's a dramatic change um, at the old age, right? The mortality increased rapidly at the old age. So what do you see in your curve, right? Like explain the variation of mortality or variation of survival in each population, right? Um, so that's one point. That's what I meant by key patterns you see in your data related to your hypothesis. So again, do not forget both hypotheses. If you somehow forget both hypotheses in your intro section, take it back. Think about that back when you're reporting here. Now, when you report your graph, do refer to that in parentheses. And this is a good example, right? The mortality rate of historic human cohort was significantly greater than the mortality rate of modern cohort for all age classes except those older than 80 years, right? That's actually what I find. That's one way to interpret it, right? Now let's move on. And what else do you need to do in the results section? The graph you created should be pasted here as a picture, right? Make sure it is properly formatted, that it appears really nice. And my one is not. It's kind of missing certain points. It's kind of not clearly showing my entire legend, and and this axis is kind of whacked up. So make sure that that doesn't happen in your case. So copy it properly. I intentionally did that because I know when you copy and paste, these kind of things happen, right? So include this figure and also label the figure 1, not graph 1, figure 1, which should appear bottom of the table of the figure, and mention what it shows. Well, in my case, I would say the survivorship curves or the mortality rate of historic and modern populations in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. In your case, it may not be the same town, so adjust your figure caption accordingly, right? And there is nothing wrong with providing as much as detail possible in your figure caption, right? And also you can explain what the two axes are. The x-axis is actually age classes in years, and then on y-axis is the fractional mortality rate. And actually in mortality rate, you can cut off. You don't have to actually include to 1.20, right? Because mortality does not increase above 1, right? But when you copy and paste it, when you reformat your axis, you can limit the length of the axis or the extent of axis from 0 to 1, right? Mortality rate cannot exceed 1, right? And remember, this is coming as a fraction, right? So if you consider into a percentage, mortality rate cannot be more than 100%. Okay, and do not repeat exactly what is mentioned in your life history table or in the figure. Now here's a question for you. Do you think you should also copy and paste and reformat your life history table that you created in the Excel? My answer is no, because that table shows exactly the same information that you are showing over here. So I don't see that as a necessity. It would be redundant to include both. But if you see something much more dramatic that is evident in the table, but that is not clear in the graph, of course add that, and then in your results section refer to that particular table, put a caption on that particular table, and refer to those points where you actually see remarkable differences, remarkable data points that connects to your original hypothesis and your original predictions. Other than if not, there's no need to put the table. It would be redundant, right? And like I do in this example, right? If I would read this part over here. However, at old age classes, right, that is greater than 90 years, the survivorship curves overlapped significantly, indicating no significant differences in the survivorship of the two cohorts with respect to older individuals or older age classes in both populations, right? So, and then I end up with that as figure 2, right? And this is my figure 2 because my figure 1 was the map, the study sites of this is the figure 2, right? Now in the results section, your job is to state your results, explain your results, interpret them, show tables and figures, or tables or figures, right? Do not interpret them. Do not cite anything, right? And that happens in the discussion section. In the discussion section, reflect on your key findings again. What are the most critical points in your results section and highlight that back here? Okay. Again, another point I want to mention in the results. Most students tend to report results in passive voice. Well, that's okay, but I strongly encourage to use active voice. I found my results indicated that, my results suggested that, right? So use active voice, past tense, right? It's actually, it's easy to read it, it's easy to write it, and it's more sensible when you write in active voice. Now that advice is particularly regarding when you work in ecology. In other disciplines of biology, things might be different. In the discussion component, right, back to going to the discussion, I mentioned you have to first reflect your key findings, like summarize them. Do not copy and paste the same sentences, right? That's not what you're doing here. Reiterate, emphasize most important findings in your results. That may be as short as a couple of sentences. And now explain and interpret your results, right? What are the key drivers behind the observed differences in the survivorship, right? Now, you already remember in your introduction, you provide a rationale for your hypothesis, rationale for your predictions, right? Now you can actually bring the same points back and elaborate in greater detail. Elaborate the examples or the papers that you read, right? Provide more details in support of your findings. It's also okay to provide some examples, some counter evidence to your results, right? I mean, for example, you can say while Smith et al. 2015 reported blah blah blah, which parallels, which is similar to findings I reported. However, John et al. 2008, I'm making things up, John et al. 2008 established contradictory evidence to what I found. And like that, it's completely okay to cite in support of your findings and also briefly reflect on the possibility of different ways, different results, right? And it's also cool to explain like why you find similar results in certain cases and why you find dissimilar results in certain cases. For example, if other studies you found or other points you referenced are related to the northeastern part of the North America or northern or western Europe, right, you might find actually a lot of similarities. The human demography or the pattern of human population survival is largely similar between North America and Western Europe, right? If you compare any data from somewhere like Eastern Asia, you know, those populations have like particularly Japan, Korea, South Korea, their survivorship could be much greater than what we experience in North America, right? And certain European countries might have, like Scandinavian nations might have different survivorship patterns, and certain Eastern European countries have a different survivorship. South Asian countries have a completely different survivorship pattern. So although it is the same species, in different geographies you are going to find different survivorships. I mean, you can actually explain results for that, right? Because the mortality risks are different across the world. In North America, largely it is non-contagious diseases. Well, COVID aside, it's mostly like, what is the greatest mortality risks? Diabetes, or health risks are diabetes, heart attacks, right? Generally cardiovascular diseases, cancer to a certain degree, right? How about in other countries? Well, if you look at certain parts of Central Africa or Southern Africa, it is largely, Western Africa in particular, it could be actually parasitic infections, vector-borne diseases, right? That is hardly a problem in North America. So, and those kind of medically related problems are quite rare in Eastern Asia, right? And also, in South Asian parts, like there is the risk of obesity related issues could be, extremely high, like about 6 times higher in certain South Asian communities, right? Compared to Caucasian communities. So that there are interesting findings you can report, right? And also think about the actual ethnic variations between historical and current populations. Historically, the human population might have been quite homogeneous, but now it could be quite diverse, right? So other those ethnicity-driven genetic medical complications could actually confound the mortality risks or mortality patterns we see today, right? So there's a huge genetic component if you try to understand human mortality, right? Certain ethnicities or certain races have a genetic bias towards or a deep predisposition towards certain non-infectious diseases. And even some of the recent results in the medical sector have uncovered that certain ethnicities have a greater risk even for infectious diseases. It's quite interesting to understand these genetic predispositions, right? So like that, you can actually do some really interesting interpretation and explaining the patterns underlying your results. So you will dig into some interesting medical literature as well as demography literature. And you already know how to search literature. So, just do a little bit more of that. So I did mention that I asked you to compare and contrast with other work, like compare and contrast. So some of the work you compare could be similar, some of the work you compare could be dissimilar to your findings, right? It's also okay to compare your findings to other apes, not all the other primates. That may not make any sense, right? But generally comparing certain basic demography patterns with other long-lived primates or other long-lived apes like chimpanzee, like in the Wood et al. Paper you read, that's fine. And there's a lot of literature and anthropological literature and biological anthropology literature studying that kind of aspects. So any literature you have already read for your introduction, can you reuse it? Of course you should. I strongly encourage that as the starting point, right? And also sometimes if you read back that literature, some of the citations in that paper you read can provide some more literature for you to compare and contrast or to provide explanations, right? So doing this cross-referencing is quite interesting, and it could actually help you to dig out really cool information. So in total, at the end of this section with the intro, results discussion altogether, you will end up having 4 references. So totally you'll have 4 references, and so you have to do 2 more additional, right? And remember that out of all 4, 2 of them must be primary sources of literature, right? So journal articles in general. And I strongly encourage you to read more, because you can actually write better and learn better if you do. And also towards the end, and like I mentioned earlier, do separate paragraph. Each of my bullet points, could actually be a new paragraph, right? So towards the end, you should be talking about strengths and limitations of your study. Think about how would you do this any better, right? What are the limitations first? What are the strengths, right? Well, limitations wise, you only visited one cemetery for a particular historical cohort. Well, you could have visited multiple in your same town, or multiple towns in your region, in your county, would have provided better data, right? And there's certainly some bias, right, towards when you pick certain tombstones. Some of the tombstones, I mean, since the data is coming off of reading headstones, if certain headstones are not readable, you don't include them. That means you might exclude some of the older burials, and sometimes older burials may not have a headstone, right? And you might actually, kind of unfortunately ignore some of the historical burials, right? Even if you visited ancient cemeteries that do not any longer take burials, right? So there is some sort of a sampling bias that is hard to avoid unless you actually visited your county and actually collected data from the county office or from your medical examiner's office, right, to dig out all the historical literature. So there is some sort of a sampling bias that count against most historical burials. What kind of strengths can you think about? You have a great sample size though, right? Although you did not visit multiple cemeteries, 100 tombstones, 100 burials, that's a lot of data, right? And actually collecting, roughly, did you collect roughly same amount of males or females, right? If it is the case, it's a strength. If not, you can discuss that as a limitation. Now, if you don't have equal number of males and females, do not go back and collect data, right? That's okay, right? Your results can have certain caveats, that's fine, but I want you to discuss that caveat, right, if that is applicable. So like that, think about the design wise, the problems you encountered, errors you may have faced, and then the strengths you have, right? So when you are explaining limitations, don't mention like that, if I were to redo this. No, not like that. Just discuss, my study carried certain limitations or weaknesses, which includes blah, 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 blah. That's it, right? Future directions. Now, if you were interested in studying human demography, right, what other, not just for you, right, for other people in this field of anthropology, in the field of primatology, in the field of demography, right, what kind of other future research can be undertaken based on your findings, based on your inferences, based on your results, right? What could be interesting questions that can be explored, right, that are actually important in the discipline of human demography, right? And finally, underscoring the importance of your finding in general, maybe with related to increasing human survival, decreasing human survival, highlighting importance of medical sciences, right, or highlighting needs for better health services and human services, right? Things like that. What are the broader importance of your study? And do not forget to cite, okay? Whenever you are comparing and contrasting, explaining your results, you need to cite. Then the last part in the order is actually literature cited, okay? Which is also known as bibliography, also known as references, right? So you will have a total of 4, and 2 of them are going to be primary sources. Having more is better, and I will actually certainly value your effort when I decide your final grade for this assignment. Chapter 6 of your lab manual is actually the way you need to format your references. And again, I earlier mentioned this reading guide, right? So use the reading guide. And read those chapters I particularly mentioned. In general, if you are weaker at writing, if you struggle in writing, read this book throughout, because it provides a lot. It's an easy read, it's a quick read, it's written in a very simple language. If you are somebody who's struggling in writing, believe me guys, I'm not going to call names, few of you are actually struggling in writing, right? So this is exactly why we recommend these books. That's why we make you buy this book, because it actually teaches you something. Well, next part is actually how to write the abstract. Now, you are writing the abstract the last, but it should be in a paper on the top, right? So, because in order to write the abstract, you have to complete the entire paper. That's why you write it the last. But in the order, it comes on the top of the paper, and it's a very important part of any paper, right? So in terms of the length, it should be very short, about 150 to 200 words, not longer. Shorter is better, not longer. So what do you include here? Now it should be one single paragraph where sentences flows into each other, right? It should not be in bullet forms, right? And in fact, nowhere in this paper should you ever write anything in bullet points, right? So state the most important information from your introduction, right? Um, and then specifically state your hypothesis or your objectives, right? Clearly state them. And then what was your most important results? Like what did you glean out of the graphs you plotted with respect to both hypotheses? And then from the discussion, state a couple of very important explanations in support of with regard to your results. And that's it, right? Abstract should be very extremely short, right? And then I only allocate about like what? Extremely small amount, like not more than like 2 to 3 points from the entire assignment, right? So it's going to be extremely a small component, but do write it. I will see if it is present or not, right? And I will see how well it is written, but the point distribution for that is quite small because actually writing an abstract is harder. That's why. Well, with that, I'm going to conclude this particular part of the lab assignment. Good luck with writing it, and if you need any help, always drop by office hours. All right, guys, have fun. Bye bye.